So for the last session before the lunch hour, we're going to have a moderated Q&A that is going to be moderated by William and Mary's own Professor James Kaste, who's from the geology department. And I looked at his website, his faculty website, so I could figure out how to introduce him, and I couldn't understand about 3/4 of it because it has so much scientific language in it, but I think I got the gist of it, so you can tell me. He's a great guy, but his research explores chemical and physical processes operating near the Earth's surface. Okay, we got that, right? With a focus on quantifying sediment transport, chemical weathering, and the fate of carbon and contaminants in the environment. Okay, but this part I think is the key for our symposium. His aim is to understand how processes at the Earth's surface are affected or disrupted by human activity and global change. So we're hearing once again the term disruption, which I think every one of our speakers has mentioned so far today, which is very interesting. It's a lens that I had not really thought about myself. You know, we talk about conflict, we talk about all sorts of things, but disruption to all of the systems on Earth as we know them, you know, global governance, just human activity, housing, where people live. So this is a perfect link. What I like also about what I saw on his website is that his work is highly applied. Again, it's not just theoretical. He really links what he is doing in the field, in the classroom, and he engages in extensive field work with his students and brings them right into the heart of his teaching and his activity. So I'm going to introduce you. Jim, thank you so much. And at this point, we're going to be taking questions from online and from the audience. And just a discussion. We have half an hour to kind of recap the morning and digest what we have heard from all the different speakers and ask about next steps. So.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting my participation here. It's been awesome to hear the different speakers and learn about the different perspectives of the impacts of climate change on conflict. Yes?
We're realizing that if you hear questions from the audience or online, you need to repeat them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So do we, I guess my role in concert with Alissa is to moderate some questions from the audience here, that also if there are any questions that are coming in online. So it sounds like we have at least 2 questions, and I can't read those from where I'm at.
Someone asked, what NGOs should our students be aware of in this space?
What NGOs should students be aware of in this space? Anyone want to take that? Sarah, did you nod your head or? Oh.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
My microphone's on. So I've really been interested in the domestic context here in the United States over the last few years. And absolutely the most exciting work that I'm doing is with a group called Organizing Resilience. And it's a new group of climate disaster survivors from New Jersey to Puerto Rico to Louisiana to Texas, rural Alabama, just every place in America that is being repeatedly hit by climate disasters. And they bring not just a humanitarian perspective, but a kind of political power analysis and the ways that disasters create openings for better governance. And it's mostly women who are leading these organizations, who are community organizers in places around the country. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, but I think that our image of a climate organizer is Greta Thunberg, or someone who's at the front of the protest march carrying a sign or delivering something to the UN that goes viral on social media. And we're much less likely to see people who are kind of in their communities, disaster after disaster, organizing people who live in that place, who will continue to live in that place, to organize together to help each other and to make demands of the government, whether that's at the state level, the local level, the national level, the international level. And I just find that incredibly exhilarating because it feels really real and it feels like sort of so responsive to the kinds of challenges that everyone is describing here. So that's one group, Organizing Resilience, that I'd like to plug.
Awesome, thank you. Do any other panelists want to follow up on that? What NGOs can students participate in the space of?
I'm not sure if this is working, but maybe. I guess I would just, to lay out the landscape, I think there are a whole range of kinds of NGOs working at a very more local level, NGOs at a national level, and then of course organizations that do work overseas. And some of them are NGOs, some are work under contract to organizations like the UN or USAID. And almost any organization working on some kind of disaster relief these days is de facto working on climate. And so as you think about particularly international, organizations on the ground, whether that's the International Rescue Committee or Mercy Corps, they are all dealing now significantly with climate related elements. So one of the issues, I think, is where you want to do that work. And there's work to be done everywhere. So just to frame it a little bit.
Can I just
Yep, go ahead, Kelly.
can I do this?
I think
Turn
so.
it on. It's at the top.
There we go. To add to that, it's also broken down into litigation, for example, or into policy or into science. So there's all sorts of different disciplines that it can be broken down to as well. If you're going into litigation, I'd say look up our Children's Trust, or look up our partners Greenwatch in Uganda, or look up our partners in Baja California called Defensa del Noreste. So there's just a number of NGOs that are working on science, that are working on public health. Pediatricians are some of our biggest advocates. So going into the medical side. So it depends on where the interest is, but we can find a spot for any student that wants to work in this field.
Anyone else want to follow up?
I would just say also that the refugee organizations are very climate focused, and we haven't really even talked much about the, sort of running through, I think, a lot of the things that we were talking about is climate-driven migration. And whether that's internal within the boundaries of a country or transnational migration, huge driver of the migration from Central and South America to the southern US border. And so any of the organizations that historically have done refugee work are basically doing climate work now as well.
Awesome, thank you. So are there other questions? There's one more. Okay.
It seems to me that any system approaching peak capacity is increasingly vulnerable to even minor stressors, magnifying their effects and making a whole system breakdown more likely. Speakers have alluded to aspects of this phenomenon. Does it apply more broadly in this context, and is it helpful in assessing the risk of coming stressors?
We're talking about
So I
organization.
think peak capacity was the key there. And are these localized examples, or is it more broad? That's what I'm trying to. Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
Well, it's not very clear, but one of the things I think is it varies from one locality to there's a special dimension to some of these issues, right? So what is operating at a local level will definitely generate different types of issues. So we shouldn't, we must put context usually when we look at these issues so that one can drill down to how it's evolving. That's why in our case we look at how is it evolving at the national, subnational, and sometimes at very specific localities. Thank you.
Are there any?
I was just add one thing. One of the complexities of coming up with solutions for climate change is that it's not bad all at once everywhere. There are emergencies that essentially are going on in different places and of different kinds, and the degree to which it's related directly to climate change vary as well, although there may be a climate element in all of them, just as Tomo was pointing out with the Pakistan case, where there is probably both a climate element to the floods and a corruption element and an incompetence element and everything else. So how do you allocate that? So I think that when we think about stressors, you have to just decide what you want to focus on and then apply yourself to that, but knowing that it is real that the world is warmer and that is changing a whole array of things. I think does that sound right?
Yes. Yeah.
To how to...
It's right, and that's kind of one thing that strikes me. It's not bad everywhere all the time. So how do you convince the world as a whole that the cost of inaction exceeds the cost of action?
Right.
And I think that's a big part of the challenge for mobilizing and galvanizing change.
I think it also is interesting the intensity and the frequency of disasters is also changing people's perspectives on things. So we think about kind of the capacity of the system, but one of the stressors now is just how often and how many disasters there are. At Carnegie, one of the things I'm doing is building a database of US disasters since 2015. And the US has a relatively developed system for disaster recovery where we have FEMA's response. We have an almost invisible but very large pot of money that comes from the Housing and Urban Development Department for long-term recovery. And the system is built in the image essentially of Hurricane Katrina, that these are extremely rare, extremely dramatic, once-in-a-generation kind of things that happen that require extraordinary response. And the reality is that the disasters are now so frequent. So when I was at the housing department in Houston, we were administering federal money for like 6 different disasters that had happened in the last 3 or 4 years. And they're storms that are not even named. People would talk about it like the tax day floods of 2015 or the Memorial Day flood or the Halloween flood. And floods that were so significant that they got large federal appropriations to recover from. But it's not Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Harvey or something super dramatic that made national and international news. It was like a heavy rainstorm on a Tuesday that was devastating. And so I think that there's this idea of what is the intensity of the capacity of the system and also the intensity of the events and their frequency that make it, one of the things I took from Johnson, your presentation, and also Tomo, the kind of the many different lines. Both of you had these, there's so many different intersecting things. It's low-level stuff that becomes very intense because it's so frequent, because it's so unpredictable, because it's so erratic. And that's, I think, just a huge driver of the system right now.
I mean, just to add that when we look at the complexity of the stressor, we have to keep in mind that they are not always in situ. Like what we find in South Sudan, that some of the flood, as I said in my presentation, comes from water that flows from Uganda or from Ethiopia. So if you have to look at these things, you have to look at intersections, right? Both in space and in systems, because it's not always something that happened in that locality that actually generates that stressor. And also we are dealing with mobile systems, mobile livelihood systems, which means people are always moving, and how you customize the stressors in which really generates the kind of conflict has to be reconfigured. We have to think differently. Otherwise, to really pin down how we solve them, it's a problem. And that is a lot of the challenges we face in the mission, because the system is, we are dealing with highly mobile system, including some of the stressors. Thank you.
Yep, go ahead.
Yes, I want to share one example from the Pacific. I think Kiribati or Marshall Islands, I forgot which one, but some small islands of the part of this country is now given the massive investment in the so-called coastal protection, like hundreds of millions of dollars to protect the coastlines, so that this island will not go under the sea, in the even if the several meters, sea level rise. But can we continue that kind of investment everywhere, which are posed to the similar challenges? That is a kind of question posed to everyone in the coming decades. And unfortunately, I'm a bit pessimistic about that. And that's why this kind of, as I said, so-called digital sovereignty kind of idea is floating nowadays. But whether I like it or not, people already started moving, not only because of the climate issues, but also economic reasons. Many young people already moved to other countries. They are desperate to find good jobs or other opportunities, not only the climate hazards. So we cannot really impose them, this one solution from the climate perspective, but we need to really keep in mind different actually views. Yeah, that's the reality we are, I think, operating.
Yeah, and spending billions of dollars a year to try to reinforce coastlines is not a sustainable solution.
No.
Yes, Christy. Oh, anyone in the room have a question for the panelists? Yes, in the back.
In your talk, you kind of outlined some of the risk factors identifiable, things like large populations along coastlines, islands, glacial melt. In that vein, are there specific, discrete protective factors that are identified within that countries subject to the same kind of risks have leverage to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change?
So I think the question is about protective measures, specific protective measures.
Well, we haven't studied much the intervention on these countries I mentioned, except like Philippines, the Pacific, to some extent, let's say, Indonesia. We are still at the onset of really coming up the proper measures on how to protect these countries from these climate challenges. So we are now kind of developing the concept, including these protection measures for each country or each climate challenges. So sorry, I cannot say really the concrete answers today, but hopefully we can work together on this topic. Thank you.
Yep. Johansen?
Yeah, I mean, at the level of communities, one of the things we are trying to look at is cool spots and hot spots. In other words, when there's a climate shock, what happens that some communities don't fall into conflict while others tumble into conflict. There are definitely some level of social organization, governance, and some kind of rule of law that helps them to deal with these issues. And one of the opportunities we find is that if we want to draw on local systems and knowledge of what are they doing right, that helps them to stay together against those shocks. We have to look at the cool spots. But unfortunately now the attention is to stop the conflict. So there's more emphasis on the hot spots that we lost sight of the cool spots. So this is an important academic area which we are trying to go into partnership to try to fully document what is done right by those communities. Thank you.
Teresa? Oh, sure. Sorry.
There is a very important protective measure for climate change, and that is mitigation. The IPCC has said we cannot adapt our way out of climate change if we continue to let the temperatures rise. we cannot put enough money aside to pay for the loss and damage. So while adaptation and loss and damage are essential, mitigation has to happen. And mitigation has to happen in accordance with science. The Paris Agreement identifies 1.5 as the target. 1.5 is based on political negotiations. It is not based on science. What the world is saying is we're not in an overshoot scenario. We can keep emitting because we're not at 1.5 yet. What the scientists tell us is we have been in overshoot since the year that the IPCC was formed, because that's the last time we were at 350 parts per million. 350 parts per million has been identified over and over and over again as the atmospheric boundary. We are now at 71 parts per million over. So until we return that atmospheric boundary, we will have to take these protective measures. We will have to adapt. We will have to pay for loss and damage. But we will threaten communities until we get into the safe zone. And we are not there right now.
Teresa, did you have?
Yeah, I do. I want to ask you, how often do universities get in touch with you, and what do you need from the universities?
Me?
Any of you. I mean, Tomo brought this up, and so did you, Johnson, so maybe one of the two of you.
Let me go first. I mean, I collaborate a lot with universities, including here in the U.S. I mean, I'm working with a colleague in the University of, sorry, the name just went off my name. But what we are doing, we are trying to do coding, because the danger we have is that we don't have historical data to look at trends. And one of the things to do is to code some of the existing information that we have in terms of those who are familiar with mission, they collect data as qualitative and not quantitative. So if you want to do trend analysis and look at patterns, it becomes very, very difficult. So with this colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, we are trying to code those information to see how we can recover some of this data. Similarly, in the UK, University of Coventry, we are looking at perception survey. What do people think about climate security in their own locality? Because if you don't understand how they look at the security implication of climate change, it's absolutely difficult to even put down in political spaces for them to understand. So there's a lot of collaboration going on. This is just for me, but those in Department of Rule of Law, they are doing a lot to look at the legal systems, how to help the country put these institutions together so that they can, particularly South Sudan, they don't have institutions. The whole element of training police and helping them to think in enforcement, it's been built from ground zero. So the collaboration is enormous. Thank you.
Yep. Go ahead, Tomo.
Yeah. So addition to what I propose, actually we receive every year a couple of the, I think, graduate students from Columbia University for the kind of during the summer, like an internship. So 2-3 months they work with us together at New York level, sometimes coming down to Bangkok or other regions to work with us. So that could be the options we can explore, with William and Mary Law School. If you are interested in this type of partnership, I can explore that.
Similarly, at Carnegie, we have a junior fellows program for recent college graduates. But we're doing this task force on clean energy supply chains. I'm building a database about U.S. disasters. A lot of that work is done in partnership with recent college graduates who are, helping support the research and build out these data sets and stuff. And we, for any William and Mary graduates, we'd love to have you. So.
Are there any other questions from the room? Yes.
My question is maybe a little naive, but it follows Kelly's comments. Just at a general level, how do you folks in your respective
So the question is, how much emphasis should we put on the sort of mitigating and combating and planning for the issue versus actually slowing down carbon emissions, I think which would be, it's basically, this is an atmospheric pollution problem.
Well, we're a small shop. We're 30 people. We focus exclusively on phasing out fossil fuels so that we can mitigate the damage, so we have to do less adaptation and less loss and damage. If we were bigger, perhaps we would do more, but we do one thing and we try and do it well.
I'll just sort of follow up on that. And as Christy mentioned, I study air pollution. And this is an air pollution problem. The primary cause is greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's driving all the problems. So we do have to attack that directly. And I teach intro students. I teach the next generation. I'm lucky to do that. And I try to give them like bright spots. We have examples from the past when we have stopped air pollution. So for example, we used to burn leaded gasoline in the 1950s and the 1960s, and eventually in the 1970s, we said we can't do this anymore, and Congress enacted legislation that put it to a halt almost instantly. So we phased out leaded gasoline. We've also phased out sulfur dioxide emissions, which caused acid rain. So I like to go through these examples where, okay, science identified a problem and legal action was taken, and that actually worked. So I'm curious, actually, Sarah, I think you mentioned this, that governments have a lot of power to step in here, and so why, I know it's a very complicated problem, but why has policy been so slow in this case, where we have examples in the past where policy has acted quicker?
Politics, man, is a bear.
It is.
And it turns out that this stuff really matters to people in their daily lives, and it's forcing lots of trade-offs. And Johnson, I was taking notes as you were talking about, Egypt's choice. They won't do a dam because it'll restrict food production. And if you have to tell a bunch of Egyptian voters that we're going to reduce food production, that constrains your policy choices. And so I think one of the things I'm really interested in is the intersection of policy and politics, and that we have to build political will to achieve the policy solutions that are necessary, and we have to do that at scale. So one of the things in Harris County, where I live, it's 4.6 million people. It's a big place. There's a lot of people who live there, and the U.S. just passed a really big climate package, the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, sort of signature piece of climate legislation that is as big as, it's bigger than anyone has done at any government, and it's also nowhere near big enough. And so one of the things that Harris County is trying to do with that money is to, in Texas we have a lot of issues with extreme climate swings, and the power goes out because our grid is disconnected from the rest of the country. And so people are very attuned to the risk of either extreme heat or extreme cold and your power going out. And what local leaders in Harris County decided to do was to assemble other large counties to make a big application to the Environmental Protection Agency's program called Solar for All, where they would build their own local power company to do local generation on county-owned land. The county is the largest holder of vacant land, and that you could build solar generation at the local level that would be locally produced and distributed, and that you would run a campaign around that to tell people that who was responsible for keeping the lights on. And there has to be, I think it's too easy, and I certainly experienced this when we were spending Harvey recovery money. So we got $2.5 billion between the city and the county in Houston after Hurricane Harvey to do things like build affordable housing. We put thousands of units on the ground, and it's like the best kept secret that no one knows about. And there's no virtuous cycle that says, oh, we would like to have more of that. And so I think that the connection between the scale of the policy response is directly related to the political appetite for those responses, and that people have to see on some level the benefits in their own lives to the policy interventions, because we're asking people to make difficult choices. And there's a lot of effort to make this all about win-win and to incentivize good behavior and lots of carrots. But the reality is that some of this stuff is very hard. And telling the voters in Egypt that they're going to have less food is a hard policy to sell.
Yep, go ahead, Alissa.
Just thinking here in the United States, it is actually possible for government to take steps. They often don't, as we know. There's all kinds of lobbies and interests that work against that. But I think when you leave the United States and to a great degree Western Europe and a handful of other countries, that capacity to get government to be organized enough in a whole multitude of places which are dealing with considerable disorder, both inflicted by climate change and by longstanding. One thing that both Tomo and Johnson spoke about is some of these conflicts go back a long ways. They're not new. They have no bandwidth nor enforcement capability to actually, first of all, conceive of a piece of legislation that would either mitigate or actually reduce a carbon footprint, and then put it into action and enforce it. And so, in a sense, to me, that creates a moral demand or burden or responsibility on the part of those countries that do have that capability to do that much more, because it's just going to have to be that way until there's more capacity built in a number of places. And some of those places, it will be a very long time. Some places less long, it will vary. Anyway, just a perspective.
Johnson?
I mean, we have to look at this policy issue at different layers. National policy, because when you look at the global dynamics, a lot of countries, in developing countries like Africa, they have complied at the level of national policy to do what they are requested to do through the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In other words, to prepare what they call the NDCs, Nationally Determined Contribution. To me, that was a very important policy steps. But then the question is, how do you roll that out? It has failed. And it's getting worse for countries, fragile and conflict countries, because they are further fenced out by the fact that they are in conflict, which is triggered and amplified by climate change. So they are locked in a virtuous cycle where the ability to attract private investors is not there. They are considered as very high risk, and the ability to source global resources, like through the Green Climate Fund, is not also there. So it's not just an issue of national policy, but it's an issue of the global framework failing some of these people to do what they are supposed to do in order to start building some systems that is required. I mean, the element, the UN also is playing their part in reducing their carbon footprint. In a country like South Sudan, more than 50% of the carbon footprint is the UN, the peace mission. So, so they have been obligated, the Secretary General has taken an engagement to reduce the UN carbon footprint by 80% by 2035, which now is obligating everybody to see how do we do energy transition and so on. But the question is, how do you do that and leave the people? Because it has to be accompanied by the people. None of that is there unless there is resources. So the bottom line is finance. South Sudan, for example, have only mobilized 1% of the resources that they require to implement their NDC. They made a budget, they came out with a figure, but so far they have mobilized only 1% from the vertical funds. In other words, the Green Climate Fund and the GF, Global Environment Facility. How do they go about that with the enormity of this kind of issue? It's difficult to say. Thank you.
Great. Okay, Tomo, go ahead.
Just one quick, actually, intervention from my side. In terms of the adaptation strategy, I found a very interesting example, actually the economic policy implemented by Bangladesh government. They established so-called hundreds of free economic zones where inviting the investment and establish factory, basically for economic reason. But one of them was dedicated to the so-called climate-induced migrants, actually accommodating 6,000 climate migrants from the other regions of the countries. They gave the job opportunities, accommodation, hosting these migrants and family to stay there, accessing this not only financially but also education and others. These are very remarkable examples or attempts. Actually, the government tried to accommodate or cushion these climate challenges. Of course, mitigation is the best approach, but in some cases, adaptation needs to follow. Then this is one of the small example maybe, but developing countries are trying to adapt. So I wanted to share this example.
All right, thank you, Tomo. So I think we're going to break for lunch now. So thank you to the speakers and panelists.